All right, everybody, let's go ahead and do a bonus video because I think railroads are awesome and I'm going to geek out and go into more detail than what the reading does. So, without further ado, actually, I should tell you I left my microphone at school. Hopefully, the audio is okay. Just a little disclaimer there. In any event, one big question we should consider is why railroads were so important for industrial growth in the 19th and early 20th century in the United States and the world for that matter. So prior to railroad growth, it was really difficult for companies to move products to distant locations on land. And a transportation system was needed to efficiently and cheaply move raw materials to factories and the finished goods to consumers. So, of course, you can surmise that water travel was the primary means of transportation prior to railroads, but river and canal transportation were limited because water froze in the winter, and also just in general, that just meant that transportation was much more accessible in areas that had lots of waterways. And of course, if you are a geography geek like me, as the United States tries to expand further west, this is going to become an increasing issue. So, railroads solve the problems that just water only transportation had. And within a few decades of development, railroads became the most important method of moving goods and people. And the operation of railroads depended on the use of telegraph communication to both communicate location and to prevent collisions. So actually, let's talk about telegraphs for just a minute because they're fascinating also. So this engraving included scenes and people related to laying the Atlantic or the transatlantic telegraph cable. And the invention of the telegraph, it included Benjamin Franklin, Cyrus W. Field, and Samuel Morse. And in this cartoon, you see President Andrew Johnson reading the morning news in Europe, and Queen Victoria is reading the news from the United States, laying the cable ship at the center. So if you want to really examine this further, I broke it up into quadrants so you could pause and just check them out really quickly. If you're one of my students and you're looking along in the slides, just note that I am still editing these and those numbers on the lower right are going to change. And this is just one more interesting representation. Again, I broke this up into quadrants. It's a little pixelated when I blow it up, but if you pause, maybe you can notice some details here. All right, moving forward, let's talk about some railroad specific innovations now. So the width or gauge of railroad tracks was standardized after the Civil War, I believe, and that allowed trains to much more easily travel from different railroads. They didn't have to switch tracks anymore. 4 standardized time zones also were created. There used to be literally, I believe, over 100 different time zones throughout the United States. And these 4 time zones were established in 1883. And what this did is it made it much easier to create a standard set of arrival and departure times all across the country. So scheduling both passenger and freight trains was much easier after that. Another big innovation was that tracks were made out of steel. They used to be made out of iron, and that allowed trains to carry much heavier loads. The state and federal governments gave railroad companies major grants of land. It amounted to over 180 million acres. This provided an incentive to build even more lines, and it also encouraged settlement further west. This man that you see on the right is named George Westinghouse. He patented the first automatic air brake, and that made train travel much safer. And we'll talk about the Pullman cars in a future video when we talk about the Pullman strike, but those are also fascinating. Let's get into the Transcontinental Railroad. So it has its roots way back during the antebellum era. The goal of building a railroad from coast to coast was addressed by the Antebellum Congress beginning in 1838, which is interesting given that the United States did not have a border on the Pacific until, let's see, well, technically, if we're considering statehood, We could say when Oregon was added to the Union. And when was that? 1845? I literally forget. Apologies. In any event, that's interesting. So various plans and routes were proposed because the North and South each wanted the route to start in their own section. So actually, this is literally a cause of the Civil War, this debate about where to lay the railroad. It's not a cause per se, but it's yet another source of sectional tension. And the secession of the southern states in 1861 cleared the way for construction to begin in the North, as you can see here. Congress approved a northern route that would connect Omaha, Nebraska with Sacramento, California, and later that line was extended all the way to the coast at San Francisco. These lines were built by both the Central Pacific Railroad, starting in California, and the Union Pacific Railroad, starting from the Missouri River west. So you can see, and of course, it eventually joined with a network in Chicago that went all the way to the East Coast. Congress passed two important acts in the 1860s to, again, continue to forward railroad development, which is interesting because that was in the middle of the Civil War. So one of them was in 1862, one of them was in 1864. And a few factors led to the need for more labor on the Central Pacific line. So let's consider that for a second. This is a really, really important shift in the source of American immigration. And there was a silver rush in Nevada, and that drew away a lot of workers. And so, and also white workers often went on strike for higher wages. And there was a deadline to complete the Transcontinental Railroad. I do not recall that deadline offhand. A private railroad owner named Charles Crocker convinced his partners to hire Chinese workers, and many of whom had emigrated during the gold rush in the 1840s. Private railroad companies also hired thousands of African American laborers who were seeking new employment opportunities outside of the South after emancipation following the Civil War. And those two acts of Congress that I just mentioned permitted the government to make grants of public land to private corporations for the construction of this transcontinental railroad. The grant stipulated, there's a lot of mumbo jumbo, a lot of numbers, but just in essence, the government granted a payment of, my notes, here we go, $48,000 for every mile of track built in mountainous terrain, and it promised low interest loans. So there's a huge speculative boom as well fueling this railroad. And in fact, we could point that boom to some of the fallout during the Panic of 1873. Which we already looked at when we studied Reconstruction. Building that railroad was extremely difficult, as you can surmise. Most of the labor was done by hand. Rail beds were created with pickaxes, hammers, crowbars. Dirt and rock was carried away in baskets and carts. Tree stumps had to be rooted out. Tracks were laid down by hand. They drove the spikes into the ground. Aqueducts were constructed. Tunnels were constructed. Good example, the ridges in the Sierra Nevada mountains were 2,000 feet above the valley, and laborers were literally lowered in baskets to hammer at solid shale and granite and insert dynamite. And much of the work on this passage, it was completed during the winter of 1865 to 1866, again, middle of the Civil War. 3,000 workers lived and worked in tunnels dug beneath 40-foot snowdrifts. Accidents, avalanches, and explosions took place, and approximately 1,200 laborers were killed in the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. Fascinating stuff. So the cost of construction. It's important also to consider the impact that railroad construction had on indigenous people. This land that the federal government was granting to railroad companies was land that was already occupied. Oftentimes, and the indigenous response was to raid construction sites. They pulled up railroad tracks and engaged in other forms of sabotage. Indigenous people were also upset by hunting buffalo and occupation of their land as westward expansion continued. Ultimately, the struggle was won by the railroad companies and the federal government because indigenous people were treated as sovereign nations, and that meant that they weren't entitled to basic citizenship rights, including the right to sign contracts, or at least ones that were legally binding and would hold up in court. and that would also allow them to purchase land. Additionally, treaties between the United States government and indigenous nations were often broken due to the persistent desire for more land as the United States moved to close its frontier. We'll talk more about closing the frontier later. So after a lot of hardship, as we already discussed, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, and that was actually several years ahead of schedule. And because the railroad was built so quickly, with inferior materials, the whole route had to be replaced 15 years later. This is a photo, as you can see, where the railroad joined in southern Utah. So this was a very celebratory moment, as you can see here. It's also pretty cool just moving forward. We have a lot of photography to analyze throughout the rest of the year with this course. And photos are fun. All right, this is a map from 1877 of the Pacific Railroad and routes of overland travel to Colorado, Nebraska, the Black Hills, Utah, Idaho, Nevada, Montana, California, and the Pacific Coast. Pretty cool. Again, I'm a geography nerd. I like maps. So let's just pause here. You can sort of just look at this cool picture as I summarize the impact that railroads had on the development of the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So when the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, it truly changed the nation. The East and West were now united. The National Railroad Network also allowed for much faster deliveries of goods and services and people. And items that took months to move could be sent in a matter of days at a fraction of the previous cost. Western products like agriculture, coal, other minerals could again easily be moved from coast to coast, passengers, freight. You get the picture. And many people also began settling in these Western areas. By the time the 1890 census was conducted, new migration patterns and settlement I'll show you census maps actually in a later video because they're really interesting. And then many historians also cite the Transcontinental Railroad as a major factor in, again, closing that Western frontier. I keep emphasizing the frontier because it's a really major theme in a lot of American history courses, especially if you're taking an AP or college level course on westward expansion. Okay, so let's just talk really, really briefly about the legacy of railroad networks in the United States. I'll put the maps, or rather the links to the sources, in the description of this video. So honestly, they speak for themselves. So I should go ahead and maybe I can speed this up while we just take a look at it really quickly together. Because you can see on this side, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, you see this massive expansion of railroad networks. And then moving forward, and we will look at deindustrialization in the late 20th century, of course, later this semester, you can see what happens as automobile transport and also the reliance of foreign goods is going to contribute to the decreasing number of railroad networks and also the decreasing number of just available daily train services. And of course, I should have mentioned, of course, flight is going to contribute to this as well. So just, again, interesting stuff. Let's go ahead and stop it there. I hope you enjoyed this little bonus video, and then we'll pick back up with more stuff from the reading directly. Thanks for watching.